Out. The pocket watch sat on the velvet display stand in the center of the Whitmore Gallery auction floor like something a janitor had found behind a radiator and hadn't yet decided to throw out. The crystal was cracked along one edge, the case was tarnished to the color of old pennies, and the handwritten lot card beside it read Miscellaneous Estate Lot 31. Timepiece, provenance unknown, sold as is, stated 200-400. Nobody had stopped to look at it for more than 3 seconds. Out. Nobody except the man crouching beside the display stand with a jeweler's loupe pressed to his eye and the focused stillness of someone who has already found what he came for and is simply making certain. Clifford Banes was wearing a flannel shirt with a frayed collar and work boots that still had dried mud on the toe from a job site he'd left 2 hours early. Out. He was 47 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who have spent their lives lifting things rather than paying other people to do it. He ran a small watch repair shop on Barrington Street in Halifax, 2 rooms above a hardware store, a sign in the window that read Baines Timepieces, Est, 1998, and a reputation among the kind of people who still owned watches worth repairing. The woman who stopped beside him was not the kind of person who owned a watch worth repairing. Out. She owned watches worth more than most people's cars. Nadine Whitmore was 44, the 3rd generation of her family to run the gallery, and she carried herself with the particular ease of someone who had grown up in rooms where expensive things were sold. She wore a pale gray blazer that had been fitted for her specifically, and when she looked down at Clifford Banes, there was no hostility in her expression. Out. Only the mild impersonal assessment of a woman who categorized people quickly and rarely had cause to revise. She looked at the pocket watch on the stand, then at Clifford, then back at the watch. That piece came out of a box lot from the Alderman estate, she said. We couldn't identify the maker, the movements seized. Our appraiser flagged it as decorative only. She paused for a beat, the length of a sentence she chose not to finish, and then added it anyway. Out. We do have some fine horological examples in the upper gallery if that's more in line with what you're looking for. The room was not crowded, but it was crowded enough. 3 people nearby registered the exchange without appearing to. One of them smiled into his catalog. Clifford did not look up immediately. He finished his examination, removed the loupe from his eye, and then stood, unhurried, and looked at Nadine Whitmore with an expression that was entirely neutral. Out. Thank you, he said. I appreciate you letting me know. She moved on toward the upper gallery. Clifford turned back to the watch and looked at it for another long moment through the cracked crystal. Not through the loupe this time, just looking. The way a person looks at something when they've already made up their mind and are simply taking a last, quiet measure of their own certainty. His son, Patrick, was sitting in the chairs near the entrance, with his jacket on his lap, waiting. Out. He was 12, old enough to come along on jobs that interested him, and watchful enough that Clifford trusted his silence in rooms where silence was appropriate. When Clifford came back and crouched in front of him, Patrick looked at his father's face the way he always looked at it, carefully, for information. We're registering to bid, Clifford said. Patrick nodded and put his jacket back on. Clifford Banes had not planned to be a watchmaker. Out. He had trained as an electrician, spent his 20s working construction on the Newfoundland offshore platforms, and come back to Halifax at 31 after his wife, Diane, was diagnosed with the illness that would take her 3 years later. He had needed work that kept him close to home, work that could be done with his hands in a small room, work whose hours he could control. Out. His father, Gerald Baines, had repaired watches and clocks as a sideline for most of his life. Not as a business, just as the thing he did in the basement on winter evenings when the television bored him. When Clifford came back to Halifax, Gerald taught him. Not quickly, not with any urgency. Out. Just over time, in the way that useful things are passed from one person to another. Sitting side by side at the workbench, Gerald narrating in the unhurried way of a man who assumed his son had all the time in the world to learn. Gerald had a particular obsession. Most watchmakers had one. Out. Gerald's was Alderman Movements, specifically the proprietary escapement mechanism produced by Alderman and Sons of Fredericton between 1891 and 1923, a family manufacturer so small and so regionally focused that most national reference books gave them a paragraph if they mentioned them at all. Gerald had spent 40 years tracking down what remained of their production. Out. He had a binder on his workbench with hand-drawn schematics and photographs and correspondence from the few surviving collectors who shared his interest. His particular fixation was the Alderman Centennial, a single pocket watch produced in 1897 for the 30th anniversary of Confederation, commissioned by the New Brunswick provincial government and presented to Governor-General Lord Aberdeen. The historical record was incomplete. Out. The watch had been photographed once in 1899 at a formal function in Ottawa. After that, its trail went cold. Gerald had believed until his death that it had survived. He had no proof. He had a feeling and 50 years of knowing how things disappeared and where they went. and the patience of a man who understood that objects outlast the people who forget them. Out. Clifford had grown up with this story the same way he had grown up with the smell of machine oil and the sound of escapements clicking through their cycles. After Diane died and Patrick was old enough to ask real questions, Clifford had moved the binder from Gerald's workbench to his own. He didn't look at it obsessively. Out. But he knew what was in it the same way he knew the feel of a worn mainspring before he'd applied a single tool. From long familiarity and the specific quality of attention that comes from loving a subject rather than studying it. The Alderman estate auction had been listed in the catalog 3 weeks ago. The Alderman family, direct descendants of the original Fredericton manufacturer, had been selling off a property in Chester, Nova Scotia. Out. The catalog had been thorough about the furniture, the paintings, the silver. The box lots at the end were handled in the usual way, which is to say without much care. Lot 31 had a photograph that showed a tarnished case and a cracked crystal, and a description that used the word provenance unknown, which was the auction house's polite way of saying we didn't look. Out. Clifford had driven to Halifax from the shop that morning with Patrick beside him in the truck and Gerald's binder in the back seat. The bidding session for the miscellaneous lots began at 2 in the afternoon. The room had thinned considerably from the morning's main session. The people who had come for the landscape oils and the Georgian silver had largely collected their receipts and gone. Lot 31 was called near the end. Out. The auctioneer announced it with the practiced disinterest, reserved for items that no one expected to fight over. The opening bid was set at $200. It reached $300 in the first few seconds from a phone bidder who Clifford suspected was buying the cracked crystal rather than the watch. He bid $400. The phone bidder stopped. A man in the third Clifford, with the particular alertness of someone recalibrating, raised his paddle at $450. Out. Clifford recognized him. His name was Stuart Falk, and he ran an antiques dealership on Spring Garden Road that trafficked primarily in estate silver and early Canadian decorative arts. He was not a watchman, but he was, like most dealers who survived in the trade, a man who watched other dealers very carefully. Clifford bid $500. Stuart Falk studied him across the room, the flannel shirt, the work boots, the absolute absence of hesitation, and then he set his paddle down. Out. His expression said the math had stopped making sense. The gavel came down. Clifford signed the receipt at the side table, collected the lot tag, and went to find Patrick. "Did you get it?" Patrick asked. "Let's get it loaded first," Clifford said. He worked that night after Patrick was asleep. Out. The shop was quiet in the way of old buildings late at night. The settle of the walls. The traffic on Barrington gone to almost nothing. The building's particular smell of solder and mineral spirits and old brass that Clifford had stopped noticing years ago, but sometimes registered in the back of his awareness the way you register a familiar voice before you've consciously recognized it. Out. He worked under the bench lamp with the tools arranged to the left of the movement the way Gerald had always arranged them, small to large, left to right, so that your hand went to the right instrument without your eyes leaving the work. The first thing he did was clean the crystal residue from the bezel rim and take a long look at the case under magnification. The tarnish was silver sulfide, deep and even, the kind that takes decades of air exposure. Out. The case itself was yellow gold, 14 karat by the stamp on the inner rim, not the gilded brass that appeared in lower-tier production pieces. The hinge was hand-fitted, not machine-pressed. The tolerances were close enough that the case closed with a sound you felt more than heard, a small, definitive click that spoke to a level of craftsmanship that had nothing to do with decorative manufacture. He opened the movement side. Out. The problem with a seized movement in most cases was not the movement, it was the lubricant, oil-dried, oil-hardened, oil-turned to oil varnish that held the components as effectively as adhesive. It was the most common reason a watch stopped, and the most common reason people who didn't know watches assumed a watch was broken. Out. Clifford held the movement under the lamp and applied a single drop of solvent to the mainspring arbor with a fine brush, and then he set it aside and looked at the plates while he waited. The plate engraving was the first thing, not decorative engraving. Working engraving, the kind applied to identify a movement at the manufacturing level. Serial designations, date marks, the maker's mark. Out. He used the loupe on the highest magnification and angled the lamp until the light came across the surface at the angle needed to read impressed marks cleanly. The maker's mark was there, pressed into the lower plate in a serif typeface that Clifford had only ever seen in photographs. A&S, Fredericton, NB. He set the loupe down and sat very still for a moment. Then he picked up the loupe again and looked at the serial number. He had Gerald's binder in the shop. Out. He had brought it from the back shelf before he started. He opened it to the section on Alderman production records and found the page his father had marked with a strip of masking tape 30 years ago. A photocopy of a partial factory ledger, sourced from the Fredericton archives, handwritten in the cramped notation of a man who had been recording production information since before typewriters were standard equipment. The ledger covered the period from 1895 to 1899. Out. Clifford found the entry for 1897, ran his finger down the column and stopped. Production serial CN001. Special Commission. Governor General Presentation. Movement Designation. Centennial Escapement. Signed by Chief Craftsman. He checked the serial number on the movement plate a second time. CN001. He did not make a sound. He sat on his stool in the light of the bench lamp for a long time without moving. Outside, a car passed on Barrington. Out. The building settled once, a small sound like someone shifting their weight in a chair. Then he reached for his phone and looked for a number he had not dialed in more than 2 years. Dr. Pauline Okafor was 61 years old, the senior curator of Canadian material culture at the New Brunswick Museum in St. John, and the only living academic authority on the Alderman Manufacturing Archive. Out. She had known Gerald Banes by correspondence and had met Clifford twice. Once at a public lecture he had attended with his father when he was still learning the trade, and once 4 years ago when Clifford had contacted her about a movement he was repairing that had turned out to be from a different period entirely. She had been generous with her time on both occasions, which was not a universal quality in academic circles. Out. He called at 8 in the morning, which was early enough to be presumptuous, and she answered on the third ring. He read her 2 things from the plate, the maker's mark as he had transcribed it, and the serial number. He did not explain anything else. The silence on the line went on long enough that he checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. "Where did you find it?" she said. Out. Her voice was careful in the way of someone managing a significant adjustment to their understanding of a situation. "Chester Estate Auction," he said. "Yesterday." Another silence. "Send me photographs," she said. "Everything you have right now." He sent 41 images by 9 o'clock. Plate engravings, case stamps, the movement as a whole, the hinge fit, the bezel seam. He sent them without captions because he suspected she would understand what she was looking at without explanation. Out. She called back 2 hours later on video. She had a colleague with her on the call, a man she introduced as Professor Jacques Renaud from the Université de Moncton, who had published the only peer-reviewed paper on Alderman factory records and was, according to Pauline, the only other person in the country whose opinion she trusted on this specific question. Professor Renaud looked at the photographs in silence for close to 15 minutes. Out. He held his reading glasses in one hand and moved through the images on his screen without speaking. When he finally did speak, it was in accented English, and he was looking not at Clifford but at the image of the movement plate on his screen. "The serial designation," he said, CN001. "This is not a cataloging decision made after production. This is a designator applied at the bench, before the movement was cased. That is consistent with a single-piece commission." Out. "This is how you mark something when you know there will only be one." Pauline looked at Clifford through the screen. "If the signed craftsman's mark is where I think it will be on the underside of the escape wheel bridge. It would take a full disassembly to confirm, but everything else is consistent." She paused. "Clifford, what your father believed, the watch survived. It has been surviving." Out. "It just passed through hands that didn't know what they were holding." He asked the question that needed asking. She gave him her honest answer. The Centennial had never come to market. There was no precedent. But there were comparable pieces, the Toronto Centennial Commission of 1927, a Burke's presentation clock from the same period that had sold at Heffel 2 years ago for a number that surprised the market. Out. For a piece of this historical significance, with complete authentication, the estimate would be conservative until bidders had the chance to respond to it. She said the number that her honest assessment allowed her to say, which was between $3.5 million and $6 million, and noted that the ceiling was genuinely unknown. Clifford ended the call. He set the phone on the bench and stood at the shop window looking out at Barrington Street. Out. The morning traffic was moving the way Halifax morning traffic always moved. Unhurried by Toronto standards considered, people who still nodded at the light. Across the street, the hardware store owner was propping his door open for the day with the same rubber wedge he used every morning, and had used every morning for the 12 years Clifford had been above him. Out. Patrick appeared at the shop doorway before school, his backpack on, looking at his father with the quiet attention he had inherited from somewhere and applied to everything. "The watch," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Clifford said. Patrick looked at the movement on the bench under the lamp. "Is it the one Grandpa talked about?" Clifford looked at his son. "I think it is." Patrick nodded the way he nodded when things made sense to him. Then he went to school. Out. The black SUV appeared outside the shop on the 4th morning. Clifford saw it from the bench when he glanced up from a completely ordinary Belova he was servicing for a regular customer, idling at the curb, engine running, the particular quality of patience that belongs to a vehicle whose driver is waiting for instructions rather than simply parked. He knew the vehicle. He recognized the plates. He went back to the Belova. Out. The man who came through the door 20 minutes later was named Stuart Falk. He came without the energy of someone on a social call, which was to say he came with money already calculated. He looked at the shop with the swift professional scan of a man who assessed spaces the way other men assessed people, and then he looked at Clifford. "You bought something at the Whitmore session on Thursday," Stuart said. Out. "I buy things at auctions sometimes," Clifford said without looking up from the movement he was oiling. "The pocket watch. Lot 31, that's right, I want to buy it from you." Clifford set down the oiler. He looked at Stuart Falk with the even attention of someone who is not surprised and is not pretending not to be. "It's not for sale," he said. Stuart paused. "You paid $500. I'm prepared to offer you $35,000 today." Out. "Bank draft same afternoon." "No," Clifford said. Stuart's expression shifted into something more deliberate. He was a reasonable man in the way of men who defined reasonable as the terms I am offering you right now. "There may be some question," he said carefully, "about the estate sales catalog accuracy, whether items of exceptional undisclosed value were properly represented. The Alderman family's lawyers may take an interest." The shop was very quiet. Out. Clifford looked at Stuart Falk without any particular expression. "The lot was sold as is, no provenance, no warranty, no representation. I reviewed the terms before I bid. The sale is complete." He picked up the oiler again. "If the estate family has concerns, they can contact my solicitor, but I'd encourage you to look at the sale terms before they spend money on the call." Stuart was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. Out. He looked at the watch where it sat in the tray on the bench, and then he looked at Clifford, and whatever he saw in Clifford's posture, unhurried, returned to work, entirely unimpressed, registered in his expression as information. Patrick came through the interior door at the back of the shop in his school clothes, backpack still on, earlier than expected. Out. He looked at the unfamiliar man with the frank assessment of a 12-year-old who has spent enough time in this room to understand when something is off. Stuart Falk looked at the boy, then at Clifford, and Clifford did not look at Patrick. He kept his eyes on Stuart Falk and held them there. "$60,000, Stuart said. Out. "Final." Clifford set down the oiler for the second time and said, in a voice that was entirely level, "Patrick, would you go upstairs and start on homework, please?" The sound of Patrick's footsteps on the stairs behind the door faded, and Clifford looked at Stuart Falk and said nothing. He simply waited, which was sometimes more effective than anything else. Stuart Falk left. Out. He stopped at the door and looked back at the watch on the bench with the expression of a man who has not given up, only changed his timeline, and then he went out and the door closed behind him. Clifford picked up the phone and called Pauline Okafor. "We need to move the authentication forward," he said. Out. Pauline Okafor drove from St. John the next morning, arriving at the shop on Barrington at 9:30 in a gray Subaru, with a box of archival materials in the back and the focused quiet of someone who had spent the previous 2 days doing nothing else. She came through the door, set the box on the clean end of the bench, and looked at the centennial in its tray for a long moment without speaking. Then she put on her cotton examination gloves and picked it up. Out. She worked with the methodical patience of a woman who had been doing this for 35 years. She cross-referenced the plate markings against photographs from the New Brunswick archives. Original factory documentation, the 1899 function photograph taken in Ottawa, and a single page from a customs ledger that recorded the watch's presentation to the Governor-General's household. She used a calibrated reference loop for the engraving comparison. Out. She recorded everything on a handheld voice recorder and on paper because she did not trust single-point records for findings of this category. The maker's mark matched. The serial designation matched. The movement architecture was consistent with the documented centennial escapement in every particular that could be verified without full disassembly, and 2 particulars that required it, which she performed carefully and documented at each stage. Out. And then she found the thing that Clifford had not found because finding it required knowing that it was there and where there was. Underneath the escape wheel bridge, exactly where she had predicted, applied in the engraving hand of a craftsman who had worked at a bench for 30 years and signed his work the way other men signed letters, with precision and without flourish, was a mark so small it would have required specific knowledge to look for it. W.H.A. Out. The initials of William Henry Alderman, the last surviving craftsman of the original family operation, who had signed every centennial escapement component by hand before the series was discontinued. Pauline did not speak for a moment. When she did, her voice was careful and very quiet. "William signed this himself," she said. "He signed this one himself." She looked at Clifford. "Your father spent 40 years looking for this." Clifford was standing at the window. Out. The afternoon light was coming in across the bench the way it always came in at this hour, flat and warm, catching the dust on the upper shelf where the reference books lived. He had been standing there for a while without consciously deciding to. Patrick had come down from upstairs when Dr. out. Okafor arrived and had been sitting on the low stool in the corner the whole time, Clifford's father's binder open on his lap, following along with the particular serious attention of a boy who understood that he was watching something that would only happen once. By 4 o'clock, the authentication certificate was signed and notarized. Out. The document stated, in the unambiguous language of someone who had spent career preparing to write exactly this kind of sentence, that the movement bearing serial designation, CN001 with maker's mark, consistent with Alderman and Sons of Fredericton, with craftsman's signature of William Henry Alderman confirmed on the escape wheel bridge, out, was the Alderman Centennial pocket watch commissioned by the government of New Brunswick in 1897 for presentation to Governor-General Lord Aberdeen, the only example produced, and the only known surviving example of the Alderman Centennial escapement in existence. Out. Estimated market value, $3,500,000 to $6 million Canadian, with potential for a higher realized price at public auction, given the piece's historical uniqueness and the absence of any comparable sale precedent. Dr. Okafor shook Clifford's hand at the front door of the shop, holding it for a moment before she let go. "How did you find it?" she asked. Out. Clifford glanced back toward the bench, where Patrick was carefully returning the reference photographs to the binder in the order he'd found them. "My father taught me what to look for," he said, "and Patrick reminded me this morning to look." She smiled the particular smile of someone who understands the full weight of what has just been said, and drove back towards St. John in the early evening. Clifford went inside and called the main line for the Whitmore Gallery. Out. The call transferred twice before reaching Nadine Whitmore directly, which was not the normal route for an unsolicited inbound from an unscheduled caller. She answered with the steady efficiency of a woman who managed a dense calendar and did not waste the openings in it. Clifford said what needed to be said without preliminary. He owned the Alderman Centennial. It had been formally authenticated by Dr. Pauline Okafor and Professor Jacques Renaud. Out. He wanted to sell it through the Whitmore Gallery in a dedicated single-lot session. Silence on the line lasted long enough that Clifford could hear the particular quality of it, not a processing pause, not the rhythm of note-taking. The silence of a person rearranging something. "Lot 31? Nadine said. "Yes," Clifford said. Another silence. "I'll need to see the authentication documents. Dr. Okafor can speak to us directly if needed." "She's available," Clifford said. Out. When Nadine spoke again, the professional efficiency was entirely intact, but something that had been present in every previous exchange, a particular quality of position, a register of managed altitude, was simply gone, not replaced by warmth, not replaced by anything performed. Just absent. "We'll schedule a dedicated session," she said. "Thursday. We'll handle all the preparation from our end." "Thank you," Clifford said and ended the call. Out. That evening, Patrick sat on the high stool while Clifford finished reassembling the Belova that had been waiting 3 days for him to return to it. It was an entirely ordinary watch, somebody's grandfather's. It would keep reasonable time and mean something to its owner, and be worth nothing to anyone else, which was the condition of most things. "Are you going to sell Grandpa's watch?" Patrick said. "It was never Grandpa's watch," Clifford said. Out. "He just spent 40 years looking for it." Patrick thought about this for a moment. "So it was always going to belong to someone who found it, something like that," Clifford said. Patrick nodded. He looked at his grandfather's binder on the shelf above the bench, then back at his father. "He would have liked knowing it was here," he said. Clifford set down the case tool and looked at his son. "Yes," he said. "He would have." Patrick went upstairs. Out. Clifford finished the Belova, set it in the collection tray, and stood for a moment in the quiet of the shop. The Whitmore Gallery issued the announcement at 9 on Thursday morning. By 11, 4 international collectors had registered for remote access. By noon, the gallery had received 3 press inquiries, 1 from a national broadcaster and 2 from specialty publications covering Canadian heritage material. Out. The main bidding room at the Whitmore had more people in it by 1 o'clock than it typically held for its major spring sessions. Clifford drove to Halifax from the shop. Patrick beside him in a dark blue sweater, Gerald's binder on the back seat the way it had been on the way to Chester 4 days ago, and a different life entirely. He parked 2 blocks from the gallery. They walked through the main entrance. Out. People looked, not because of what he was wearing. The flannel shirt had been replaced with a clean one, which was the extent of the adjustment, but because his name was on the announcement, and a number of the collectors and academics in the lobby had spent part of the previous 48 hours revising their understanding of where an important piece of Canadian history had been for the past 125 years. Dr. Out. Okafor was already inside, seated near the front with her authentication documents in her lap, watching the watch where it sat on a low platform. Cleaned but not restored, every original surface present and unaltered, the cracked crystal still cracked, because the crack was part of what it was and where it had been. Out. Stuart Falk was in the fourth row, arms folded, jaw set in the particular expression of a man who has concluded that the situation has moved against him and is deciding what to do about that. Nadine Whitmore took the podium, the room quieted. She introduced the lot with precision, reading from notes she had prepared carefully, and opened the bidding at $1 million. 1 million became 2 million in the first 30 seconds, remote bidders and telephone bidders moving simultaneously. Out. 2 million became 3 million before a minute had elapsed. Stuart Falk raised his paddle at 3,200,000 with the automatic reflex of a man who still believes the situation is recoverable. The bids moved past him. 3,000,008 from a screen. 4,000,001 from the telephone. 4,000,005 from the floor. A collector Clifford did not recognize, bidding with the deliberate calm of someone who had come specifically and only for this. Out. 4,000,009 from the screen. 5 million. 5,200,000. The room went still. Nadine Whitmore looked out over the bidding floor, her voice entirely steady. 5,200,000. Going once. Nothing from the screens. Patrick was standing beside Clifford near the side wall. Out. He did not understand the numbers. They were abstract in the way that very large things are abstract to a 12-year-old. Outside the scale of anything daily life had given him to compare them to. But he was watching his father's face with the careful sideways attention of a boy who had learned that his father's face was where the information was. Going twice. The room held its breath. The gavel came down. Out. The room released, the soft percussion of applause, voices rising, phones coming up. Stuart Falk stood, buttoned his jacket without looking at the room, and walked out through the side exit at a pace that was measured and deliberate and communicated nothing. Dr. Okafor did not stand. Out. She sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the watch on the platform with the particular stillness of someone who has just watched something they spent most of their professional life caring about finally arrive where it belonged. Patrick put his hand into Clifford's. He didn't ask about the number. Nadine Whitmore found Clifford in the side corridor 10 minutes later. She came alone, no assistant, no the gallery's official composure. Out. She stood across from him in the lower-lit passage where there was nothing to perform for, and she said his name the way people say a name when they are about to say something they have thought about carefully. Clifford, he waited. What did you see in it? She asked. The genuine version of the question. The case closure, he said. The sound of the hinge fitting. Decorative pieces don't fit like that. I knew in the first 15 seconds. She was quiet. Out. You knew before I said what I said, yes. She looked at him steadily. Patrick was with you. He's been in a lot of rooms, Clifford said. He knows how to read them. She held his gaze for a moment. Your father, what did he do? He repaired watches, Clifford said. Out. And he spent 40 years paying attention to something that everyone else stopped paying attention to. Nadine stood in the quiet of the corridor and something moved through her expression that she did not try to manage. I'll send a formal letter on Monday, she said. Out. You don't have to do that, Clifford said. Not dismissively, not performing forgiveness, simply as a statement of fact from a man who had decided before he walked through her front door that he had no particular use for other people's assessments of what he was capable of seeing. But if you want to, that's your decision. He gave her a small nod and went to find Patrick. 3 weeks passed. The shop on Barrington did not change. The same sign in the window. Out. The same coffee maker on the shelf that had a hairline crack in the handle that Clifford kept meaning to address. He opened a registered education savings account for Patrick at the credit union on Morris Street, a significant contribution structured to grow without conditions, and set aside a separate amount in a business account. Out. With it, he planned to do one thing he had been putting off for 2 years, install a proper climate-controlled storage cabinet for pieces waiting on service, the kind of cabinet that would let him take on a few more significant restoration projects without the risk that concerned him every winter when the building's heating system ran uneven. He did not hire a sign painter. He did not move. Out. Gerald's binder went back to the shelf above the bench between the reference volume on Swiss lever escapements and the photocopied manual for the Waltham 1888 he used for cross-referencing grade designations. It had been there for 12 years. It would stay there. Patrick came home from school one afternoon to find a flat package on the kitchen table that Clifford had received by courier that morning from Dr. Okafor. Out. Inside was a reproduction of the 1899 Ottawa function photograph, printed archival quality, showing the Governor-General's household at a formal reception. In the foreground, just visible at the edge of the frame, the centennial on its presentation stand. On the back, in Pauline's handwriting, for Patrick Banes, who was in the room when it was found. Keep looking. Out. Clifford hung it on the wall above the bench. between a wiring schematic for a battery conversion he'd done 2 years ago and a photograph of Gerald in the shop on a Saturday afternoon sometime in the late 90s, bent over the bench in the focused posture of a man with a loop in his eye and all the time in the world. Out. On a Tuesday evening a week later, Clifford was at the bench working on a Hamilton from the 1940s, someone's grandfather's, found in a shoebox. Nothing remarkable about it except that it had kept running for 70 years and its owner wanted it to keep running for 70 more. When Patrick pulled up his stool and sat beside him. "What are you working on?" Patrick said. "Hamilton 992B, Clifford said without looking up. "Railway grade. Out. Needs the mainspring regulated. Is it valuable?" "To someone," Clifford said. Patrick was quiet for a moment, watching his father's hands, then, like the Alderman one. "The Alderman one was worth a lot of money," Clifford said. "This one's worth fixing properly. It's not the same thing, but they're both worth the attention." Patrick nodded, satisfied in the way he was satisfied by answers that told him something true. Out. He watched his father work until his eyes started closing, the way they always did when he sat still too long in the warmth of the shop, and Clifford let him sit there until his head dipped twice, and then walked him upstairs and came back down to finish the mainspring regulation before the light went. His phone lit up on the bench just before 11, a message from a number he had saved that week. "I told our board yesterday that we failed to identify a piece of national historical significance." Out. "I told them that the failure was in our process, not in the piece. I wanted you to know that I said it." N.W. Clifford read it once. He read it a second time. He typed, "Thank you for saying that. It mattered that you said it to them and not just to me." CB. He set the phone down on the bench, turned off the lamp above the movement and stood for a moment in the dark of the shop before heading upstairs. Out. Through the window, the street below was empty and wet from an evening rain, the Barrington pavement reflecting the orange of the street lamps in the long, unbroken way of a surface that has been rained on and is still settling. Clifford stood at the window and looked at it, not because there was anything particular to see, but because looking carefully at ordinary things was the habit he had been given, and it had never once failed to show him something worth seeing.